right?
But that is not actually the conversation that we came into today expecting. That was just one of the things that just kind of got rolling off the top of the head. But if you watched our podcast last week, one of the things that we had a brief discussion about was our philosophy on coaches, and particularly the head coaches. And if you've watched us a bunch in the past, you know that we realistically we have a lot of similarities in the things that we're looking for in the coaches, but myself, I am more leaning towards a head coach should realistically be in this department as opposed to this department, and you are a little bit more open-minded about certain style of coaches. And we've never really properly sat down and flushed out. I know you and I have talked about this in
Mhm.
our off time, but we've never actually done it in a system like this. For me, I don't like defensive coordinators becoming head coaches. I don't love defensive minded or defensive philosophy head coaches in today's NFL, mostly because I just don't think it works. And I think it's something in today's modern NFL that if you have a defensive minded head coach, you are putting yourself at an all time disadvantage. And for yourself, you are more in agreement with that offensive minded guys are typically doing better in today's NFL, but
Yeah.
you are more inclined to if it's the right fit, then sure.
Yeah, and that's just it. Like in today's NFL, because it is such an offensive league, they're handcuffing the defense every season more and more and more. It makes it difficult. So yeah, the offensive coordinators becoming head coaches are having more success currently. Um, but for me, it's always been more of I want to know the guy as opposed to what his philosophies were. I'm more about what does he bring in a leadership role as opposed to what does he bring in his playbook.
Yeah, and for me, I obviously I want a good, intelligent head coach that has the right
Mhm.
philosophies. I just want him to be an offensive lenient guy or more on the offensive side of the ball because again, like what you said, is that it's such an offensive league that it makes it so tough with so much changing that I really just look at it and I go, if you're a defensive minded head coach, I genuinely don't think there's any defensive minded head coach that is out there right now today that is going to win a Super Bowl. I think every defensive minded head coach in the league will not win a Super Bowl, including my Chicago Bears with Matt Eberflus. I do not think the Bears will win a Super Bowl with Matt Eberflus as their head coach. And mostly because I think you're just going to have too much changeover because let's say this year with the Bears, and I'm going to use the Bears as an example because they are a fairly good example. They have a team that on paper is looks like they're going to be a playoff team, and there are people that have talked about the Bears potentially. Why can't they go to a Super Bowl this year? They have the defense, they have the offensive pieces there, and I sit back and I go, okay, I'm not going to say the Bears are going to make it to the Super Bowl. I'm saying and thinking they're going to make the playoffs. And I think a playoff win, probably not in year number one of Caleb Williams, but we saw that with CJ Stroud, so anything's possible. Andrew Luck in his first year made it almost, he either made it to the AFC Championship game or he was almost to the AFC Championship game. I can't quite remember, but if you can get that first win, unfortunately for the Bears, if that's the case and Caleb Williams looks awesome, well, unfortunately, our offensive coordinator, Shane Waldron, he's going to get hired away to be a head coach.
Yep.
And right then and there, we always talk about switching coaches year one for a quarterback, and we typically talk about the head coach of making that change is really detrimental. But Shane Waldron, he's with Chicago. He's going to be taking guys from the Chicago offense of staff to whatever job he gets. And then the Bears are just in this cycle of just constantly trying to go find a new offensive coordinator. And when you find a really good offensive coordinator, you might only have him for a year, 2 years max. I know we talked about Ben Johnson and the guy with Houston. We were shocked that they didn't get jobs this year, but that's
Hmm.
such an anomaly that it almost never happens that way. And we're just kind of sitting back going like, okay, they got both of those teams got extraordinarily lucky that they got to keep their coordinators. And I'm just it's tough for me to go, You're constantly switching offenses. You're constantly changing things. And Eberflus can be the best philosophy and putting the right system out there that he possibly can. But if you're just constantly changing offenses, it's going to make your quarterback's life hell. We saw that with Jay Cutler for years, where he had 6 offensive coordinators in his in his 8 seasons with the Bears. That's not a recipe for success.
No, but I mean, a bit of a trend I've been noticing is a lot of the offensive coordinators that are upgrading to that head coach role, they're OCs on teams with an offensive minded head coach already.
Yep.
And so really it's they're in someone's shadow, and that's why they're moving on. Whereas you see some of the guys who are they're the OC and they've got either a defensive minded head coach, or in some cases I've got a few guys on my list that they never were coordinators. You know, they've got philosophies either towards offense or defense, but they were never coordinators. And Dan Campbell's one of them. And so Ben Johnson, as an OC, looks at that and goes, well, you know, Dan's not really stepping on my toes. I'm sort of the head coach of the offense because Dan Campbell hasn't had this coordinator experience. And so some of those situations, you see the OCs more willing to stick around, I feel like, because they go, well, I don't have to worry about if I have a couple weeks struggling that this head coach who used to be an OC is going to come over, take the playbook and go, I'm calling the plays now. You just sit there and chew your crayons.
Oh, totally.
You know?
Totally.
And so that I think is a bit of an issue. I just, the reason I'm more comfortable with these defensive minded guys becoming head coaches is because you see a little more collaboration between defensive coaches than you do with offensive coaches. You know, offensive coaches, I notice they tend to butt heads a little bit more if the game's not going well. Whereas with a defensive minded head coach and a D coordinator, if the game's not going well, they sort of get to go together and go, okay, what's going wrong? How can we shift this around, instead of, okay, you go sit down, I'm going to call the plays because you're fucking this up.
Oh, yeah.
You know?
I think with a defensive coordinator, they are definitely more cooperative with the team around. But for me, again, going back to that reason of why I prefer those offensive minded guys is because when you look at some of the guys that have been in the Super Bowl the last couple of years, obviously Andy Reid, he's always been the offensive play caller. And, you know, he's had brilliant coaches coming from him before. Doug Peterson is an example, Eric Bieniemy, you know, and Matt Nagy, before they got head coaching jobs or moved on, you know, they were respected OCs. But at the end of the day, it was always Andy Reid. You look at Kyle Shanahan, who was also there. He was an offensive coordinator for years before getting his job, and he's had a few guys move on. And when it comes to him, it's one of those things of like it's truly his system, but he's allowing his offensive coordinator to kind of do a bunch of the practices. And you're just seeing some of those top guys that are still calling those plays. Sean McVay is another really good example of that, where they go out there and it's like, listen, I'm going to be the mad scientist in the lab working at it. My offense coordinator is simply there to be the messenger to get everything there and to help teach that philosophy and move it forward. And those are the guys that we are constantly seeing going back to the Super Bowl. You know, Andy Reid, you know, he's a Hall of Famer. He's, in my opinion, Andy Reid is the greatest offensive-minded head coach in the entire history of the NFL. We've seen Kyle Shanahan be there a few times. Obviously, Sean McVay has been there a couple times, and you know, Zach Taylor, again, you know, a little bit of an anomaly, but he's still an offensive philosophy head coach. And you just kind of continue to look at some of the guys that have been there these last few years. It's these mad scientist guys that are just constantly pumping out guys, and that's essentially what you're looking for. You're not always going to find it, and there's always the risk of the offensive minded philosophy head coach coming in, but that's kind of the risk that you have to take, because if you can find one of those guys, you know your offense is never going to change, with the exception of just like the yearly changes that come in. But you know, it's not basically going, oh, we're going to put in an entirely new offense. You already, the players already know what's going to happen. And for me, that's that consistency that I would preferably like to have in the team while watching it, as opposed to a defensive minded guy who's just going in there and it's like, okay, this is our team philosophy. And I think team philosophy is a great thing to have. You need that. But then if your offense does fairly well, because again, look at Kyle Shanahan. He was with Dan Quinn for a while. in Atlanta, moves on, and then we saw really who was the more important piece of that coaching staff when Dan Quinn was with the Falcons. It was, okay, was it Dan Quinn or was it Kyle Shanahan? And it was very clearly Kyle Shanahan.
Yeah, I mean 100%. And that's just it. It's because the league is so strong towards offense, it does make more sense for teams to be rolling the dice and gambling on these, as you say, mad scientist offensive coordinators. The problem is we see that it is a gamble.
Mhm.
You know, we see a lot of them come in and just fall flat on their face, you know, like guys like Matt Nagy. You know, they just did not pan out. They were not good at all. And that's where, for me, the ability to be a leader is more important as a head coach. And that's why I'm always more willing to have a defensive guy, because I find that the defensive guys tend to be more in that leadership role than the offensive guys. The offensive guys usually will have a big head and be like, "Yeah, it's my way. This is the way it goes. You know,
They're the
I'm right."
mad scientists. They're the psychopath.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You know, the guys like Andy Reid, Sean McVay, Kyle Shanahan, Nick Sirianni, you know, people like that. You know, what it's it's just a big gamble,
Yep.
because you run the risk of being in an eternal cycle of trying to find the guy that's going to be able to get that new philosophy on offense in. And then once he's finally there and you find him, then you go, okay, now we've got our coach. Now we have to start rebuilding our team around what he wants. And so it's quite a lengthy process, you know. And of course, I'm spoiled and biased because I have had a defensive minded head coach for the last 17 years. And so it's been a long time of that for me, seeing what he's doing as a leader and bringing in offensive coordinators that unfortunately often do well and go on to bigger and better things, but occasionally do absolutely horrible. And the risk with that then is, okay, this offensive coordinator is just absolutely shitting the bed, and my head coach can't come in and fix it because he doesn't know offense.
Yeah.
So that is a big risk for sure. If you have a good enough defense, you can still win games and make the playoffs, but you're not going to win championships that way.
Yeah.
You know, so that is a big risk for sure. And that's where I think the team that finally steps up and makes the shift and goes towards like a multi-head coach faceted system where you know, or just get rid of that head coach position and you've got your OC and your DC, and these are your head coaches. I think the team that takes the risk and makes the leap on that first is going to completely shift the dynamic of this league. And I think that's what we're headed towards at this point. You know, the days of having one head coach and two coordinators, I think we're getting past that in this league. You know, because you see it with these teams with those mad scientists, the Andy Reids, the Sean McVays, the Kyle Shanahans. They're the head coach and the offensive coordinator. You know, they'll bring in an OC, and sure, that guy might, you know, help run the practices and things like that, but he's more of an offensive, not so
He's a
much coordinator, but
messenger.
an
He's a
advisor,
messenger board.
right? Like
Yeah.
he's an offensive advisor. And then they go on and get that head coaching job all of a sudden because they were under that guy. And everybody's like, oh, he must be the next great big thing because look at what this team did. And he gets into that system and all of a sudden it's like, oh, this guy cannot coach. Never mind. This is not a good decision. And so that's
I.e.
why I
Matt
think we
Nagy.
might, right? You know, that's why I think we might see that shift start to happen where it's, instead of having that three coach system, we go to a two coach system with the positional coaches underneath, you know, being the advisors. I think that would be the way for this league to go because you then would create a little bit more cohesion and a little less of the headbutting between your head coach and OC or your head. Yeah, it's always the head coach and the offensive coordinator. You don't really see that headbutting between the head coach and the D coordinator.
Oh no, and everything that you're saying right there, all this screams out to me is special teams coordinator. And your division has a head
Yep.
coach that has been there almost as long as Mike Tomlin, and he
Yep.
wasn't from an offensive background, he wasn't from a defensive background, he was a special teams coordinator. And this is one of the things that we often always see when a head coach gets fired mid-season, why the
Hmm.
special team coordinator often becomes the intern, because he already knows all the players and he's just going to go, you know what, my role in coordinator situation for the team is less so of a situation of trying to do this and that. I'm going to let the OC do what he has to do. I'm going to let the DC do what he has to do, and I'm essentially there to just get everything going.
Yeah. Well, exactly. And I mean that's John Harbaugh, and he was a special teams coordinator, but he also was positional coaches throughout his career on both sides of the ball. He's
Yes.
what I call sort of a hybrid. You know, he has offense and defensive experience. So he is sort of that unicorn in that way where he knows it all, and so he's really able to hone in on both sides. You
Mhm.
know, and I think that's why he's had so much success bringing up coordinators on both sides of the ball, because he can get in both their ears and go, well, look, I've been, you know, a positional coach, but he was never a coordinator. Him and his brother both actually never were coordinators on either side of the ball. You know, it's very unique. Jim Harbaugh was much more offense oriented. He didn't really do much on the defense, but he was only ever a positional coach. At least when I was looking through and doing my research on him, I could not find any coordinator positions at the top level.
Yeah.
Perhaps at high school, he might have been a coordinator or something,
Pretty
but
much when he retired from actually playing, he went as a offensive consultant for Western Kentucky. Then he was a quarterbacks coach for the Raiders. Then
yeah,
he became the head coach for San Diego, then head coach for Stanford, then
yep,
coach for the 49ers, Michigan, and then head coach. But yeah,
exactly.
obviously
So
him
he
being a
never,
former first round pick as a quarterback, and
yeah.
then playing as long as he did. So yeah, yeah. No, I know what you
But
mean with
that's
that.
Yeah, so the two of them never really were coordinators because, you know, an offensive consultant or associate, that's not a coordinator. You
No,
know,
that's the second
you're
lowest thing you can be on the NFL
exactly.
for a coaching staff
And
at
so those
least.
guys are unique as well. You know, there are two others right now as head coaches in the league. You know, I mentioned Dan Campbell, and the newest addition is Gerard Mayo. You know, he went from a linebackers coach after being a former player, and he is now a head coach of the New England Patriots.
Well, Antonio
So,
Pierce, you can also add to that because he was never a coordinator in the NFL.
I think he was a coordinator in college though. I do believe he was a coordinator for Arizona State. He was a defensive coordinator
So he
or offensive
was
coordinator. Sorry,
no, he's defensive coordinator.
was
So
it defense?
I'm
Okay,
looking
but yeah, I
at
think it was Arizona State. He was an associate 1 year, and then he was the straight up coordinator for 1 year as well.
so Antonio Pierce, he was the head coach for Long Beach Poly High School. Then at Arizona State, he was the linebackers coach and recruiting coordinator. And then in 2020, he was the associate head coach, co-defensive coordinator, linebackers
Yeah,
coach, and recorder. And then he was defensive coordinator and associate head coach. And then he in 2021, then he moved to the Raiders, where he was the linebackers coach, interim head coach in 2023, and now he's the head coach. So he had that kind of 1 year of being that defensive coordinator, but he was also a co. But yeah, yeah,
yeah, and that's the only reason I included him on the defensive coordinator list that I made up instead of the no coordinator list, because he did have at least 1 year in there where he did that himself.
yeah. Yeah, I just look at him and I go that 1 year at Arizona State, the defensive
Mhm.
coordinator, but I do know exactly what you mean. Gerard Mayo essentially retired from the Patriots and said, "I want to be your coach." He was their linebackers coach
Yeah,
from 2019 to 2023, and then he's now their head coach. So exactly,
exactly.
and
And
Dan
so,
Campbell was never he was an associate head coach, but
but never
nothing
a coordinator. Yeah,
exactly.
but again, more of an offensive minded guy. And so we've got four of those guys in the league right now, and that really is what creates the split. Because without those four, like we have 16 offensive minded head coaches in the league and 12 defensive minded head coaches in and then those four which I are no coordinators, you know, John Harbaugh with his hybrid upbringing able to do both offensive defense, and then Campbell and brother Harbaugh on the offensive side and Gerard Mayo on the defensive side.
Yeah.
So makes for a fairly even split throughout the league. But when you look at what these coaches have done successfully, you know, I broke it down in only using their current tenure as a coach. You know, the offensive coordinators have more success. You know, there's 4 Super Bowls and what 4, 6, 8, 10 conference championships on the offensive side of the ball, and only one on the defensive side of the ball, and that's a long time ago. Mike Tomlin, 1 Super Bowl and 2 AFC titles, and that's it for the defensive side of the ball. You know, with John Harbaugh, you can flip flop him on either side. He's the only one in that no coordinator group that's done anything. But yeah, for recent history, it definitely is more that OC that is getting the job done in that head coaching role.
Yeah, the last defensive minded philosophy head coach that won a Super Bowl that wasn't named Bill Belichick. And the only reason I named Bill Belichick is because
Yep.
he had a Hall of Fame quarterback in Tom Brady,
Mhm.
who happened to be Pete Carroll with Russell Wilson. Russell
Yep.
Wilson, I think that was year 2 of Russell Wilson. It was either year 2 or year 3, but he's the last defensive philosophy minded head coach to win that's not named Bill Belichick. And the only reason and other than that, looking before that, just going, who was the last defensive minded head coach to win with a quarterback that wasn't a Super Bowl before that? Without a Hall of Fame quarterback, I should say. Just kind of
Yep.
looking through this: Ravens, Packers, New Orleans. No, it was Mike Tomlin. But then again, you could say that Ben Roethlisberger is a Hall of Fame quarterback.
He will be a Hall of Fame quarterback at some
Yeah.
point. You know, he's not yet, but he will be. But I mean, that being said, we don't often see guys who don't become Hall of Fame quarterbacks winning championships either.
Well,
There's a few here
Yeah.
and there sprinkled in, but the vast majority end up being superstar players that will, at some point in time or another, become a Hall of Famer.
Yeah, and the only reason why I make that distinction with I you know what, I shouldn't say Hall of Famer, I should maybe say greatest of all time for Bill Belichick, because what Tom Brady did over his career, you know, we can talk about it for hours and hours and hours and hours, and I make that distinction of, you know, without Bill Belichick, or without Tom Brady being with Bill Belichick, we saw what Bill Belichick was. Bill Belichick right now is winning very much off, you know, away from football, dating a 24-year-old, which I think is hilarious.
Yeah, that's an interesting one for sure. I'll give him that. He's what, 72, dating a 24-year-old. It's a little bit bizarre.
Yeah, when she was so she would have been born in 2000. So
Yep.
he would have had 2 Super Bowls in his career, because he won one with, I forget, it might have been the Giants when he was a assistant coach with them, because I know he
Yep.
technically has 8 Super Bowl or 7 Super Bowl rings. He would have won his first Super Bowl ring when he was a head coach in 2002, when
Yep.
she was 2 years old, and by the time she was a teenager, so let's just say 2018, he might have had what, 6 Super Bowl rings.
Yeah.
Absolutely insanity.
Yeah. Yeah. But that is what it is, you know. I mean, Bill Belichick will go down as one of the best coaches of all time, but there needs to be that asterisk beside him, because without Tom Brady, I don't think he would have won all those championships. I think a lot of people realize he would not have won all those championships.
Yep.
Without Tom Brady, Peyton Manning or Ben Roethlisberger
Has
likely
more
are the guys winning
championships.
all those championships for all those years.